So I want to do some talk about story time, and that is looking at children's literature. I'm really talking about children's literature and not adolescent literature. And there's not a really one reason or another why we must talk about children's literature, but I think that it's very interesting. And it is really as good a place as any to talk about representations of gender and what are the images of gender that we begin consuming when we're quite young. And again, we're looking here at this research is primarily U.S. media, though some of them have looked at media produced in the United States, England, and Germany. So we get to this idea of what I'm calling page time, that is, as opposed to screen time, it's page time, right? Who's central and who are we seeing? And there is a video I've asked you to watch, right? It's The Ugly Truth About Children's Books. And that's not a scientific study, but somebody just went through their own bookshelf and did a sort of small experiment, and what they find in doing that is not really all that inconsistent with what the literature shows. Generally, it's sort of what you'd expect when you look at children's literature. So I gave the example for you. You just can watch a page or two of it if you wanted to, of the Diggingest Dog. And I showed that because that's a book from my childhood, actually. My sister once described it as being a book that starts out sweet and gets very dark before it turns around at the end. But yeah, The Diggingest Dog, you have, well, first off, all white people, but it's about a male dog and a little boy. So Duke is the dog, and the boy, I believe, is Sam, and their experiences. And so, yeah, I mean, that sort of story is pretty much what you expect, that girls or females are less present and less central in the story. So they might be in the story, like in The Diggingest Dog, but a woman is in The Diggingest Dog only when Duke goes and digs up her garden, right? So she's not central at all. She could disappear, and the story wouldn't change any, right? Not in any sort of real, noticeable, or tangible way, right? Interestingly, research has shown that even, or sometimes even especially, when the characters are not human, this is that much worse. And so female animals are less common in stories than are male animals. That's just sort of where we are. Also, we see that inanimate objects and animals are regularly gendered. The gendering of animals, though not really necessary, I suppose, as much as gendering anybody is, I guess, I don't know, but it's you're not entirely necessary, but we often know whether that dog is a male or a female, or we gotta know. And by the way, side note, have you ever seen somebody's reaction when you call, a female or a male dog a she? Oh, what's her name? Well, it's a boy dog. You ever seen anybody's reaction when you misgender their dog? Anyway, or some people's reactions anyway, right? But also inanimate objects. Many children's books are full of inanimate objects. Gosh, Eleanor, the height of them is Eleanor has a book, I think it might have been Peanut Butter and Cupcake, and there's Peanut Butter and Cupcake, and there was, there's an egg in the story, and there's all these different food things. They're inanimate objects. And so that is something that we get in children's stories a lot, right? And as some researchers have pointed out, this is total fantasy. You could just go wild and do anything, and often what happens in going wild and doing anything is actually the exaggeration of gender norms, which I'm going to get to in a moment. But yet, inanimate objects are pretty much always gendered, right? So the train, we always know the train is a boy or a girl. Okay, it's a train, right? Okay. And by the way, think back to when we watched the trailer for Wall-E at the beginning of the semester, right? And that gendered anthropomorphism being giving human traits to something that's not human, right? But the way we gender these inanimate objects. So the question then is not merely that there are boys and girls or males and females in these stories, but what are they like? Well, in terms of character traits, we do see a pattern. This nice study that reviews that from 2002 found that often the male characters are described with words like big, fierce, or great, and the female characters are described as weak, frightened, or sweet. I don't think I need to explore with you the implications of this, all right? What's the difference there? I think it's pretty obvious, right? Another study found that, and that was looking at 20 books that were published after the year 2000, which to me was not all that long ago, but for some of you that was when you were just itsy, I suppose. But yeah, the females were more often portrayed as being indoors. They were nurturing and did what we might think as being female occupations. They were a teacher, uh, a piano, teaching, giving piano lessons, the ballet teacher, maybe a nurse, but those sort of more female occupations, if you will. Uh, we do see in some studies, for instance, this was actually an interesting sort of, I believe it was a meta-analysis, if I'm remembering all my research correctly. Yeah, and they found that the males are really not shy. That shyness is not a trait that we see among the male characters. It might occur among females, but shyness is not a trait among males. Just emphasizing again, there are certain ideals of masculinity. And actually, that research was specifically looking at whether or not boys were ever shy, because they're saying that boys and girls in real life both deal with shyness and issues of feeling or being socially isolated. But in the literature, the boys aren't really seeing themselves. Yeah, so the boys are never really shy characters. They never get to be really socially vulnerable or feel socially vulnerable in that way. As we go on looking at character traits, there was a fascinating study done in 2014 of the way that inanimate objects were gendered. Again, these were some authors who point out that, wow, with your inanimate objects are coming to life. This is fantasy. We can really do anything. And so what we do is some of the more extreme stuff of what we already know. What they found was the female characters were likely to be, or most likely to be depicted as less emotionally stable, right? Using words like, this was actually I believe, of a cupcake, that she started to crumble. And I think about actually some of my children's books, the books my daughters had, that, I mean, we have enjoyed, it's true, but one of them was Just One More, about the little girl who's always asking for too much, and then the worst that came when she asked for too many scoops on her ice cream cone. They all came tumbling down, and how upset she was. And also a book that my daughter really liked us to read to her quite a bit. It was called My No 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 Day, which is about a child having a bad day and throwing a lot of tantrums, which every parent relates to. But again, it was a girl, so we had this female lead, but it's about the fact that she goes the entire day throwing tantrums, right? So she's just not as emotionally stable. Also, female characters were likely to be self-sacrificing or to have been abandoned. And so if you think about the story of the Giving Tree, this is, some have said I've heard, comedians and so forth sort of talk about tongue-in-cheek, and others not so tongue-in-cheek, that the story of the Giving Tree, if you're familiar with it, and if you're not, just look up the Giving Tree and search for it on YouTube, and someone will be reading it to you. Which I still remember Mrs. Roberts, our first grade teacher, reading that to us. But anywho, right, it's all about a tree that keeps giving of its limbs, right, of its body to this little boy, and even at the end, when it's nothing more than just a stump, it's a place for the boy to sit down. This boy's not an old man to sit down, so always self-sacrificing, and also sometimes abandoned. So a house is a old farmhouse is gendered as feminine, that is then left abandoned amongst an industrial scene. So that's, yeah, so these females are self-sacrificing, or they're abandoned. The males have a tendency to be hyper-masculine, like the mighty dump truck. And we see often these depictions emphasize that they were large, and how strong they were, and often they were also obviously emotionally stable, as I've already suggested. They were emotionally stable, but often that they're leaders. They're organizing people, they're taking charge, they're guiding us through. That's something you're seeing. And again, I don't think I have to spend a lot of time really unpacking that. So to move here to a moment of commentary, and that is that this is me speaking to you more personally than out of research, but some of it is important, worth knowing, and some it's not. I'll try to distinguish that for you here in this slide. But I do want you to understand that the goal of representation of, here we're talking about girls and boys, but in fact we're talking about females and males. The goal is not for the girls to be like boys, right? Or that the goal is that we want the girls to suddenly be masculine, right? Because that then reinforces this masculinist obsession, the idea that the ideal is to be male, is to be masculine, because being female, ugh, gosh, awful, right? We've talked about that before. We can end up in that pattern of only valuing the things that we see as being male or masculine, and not having and devaluing or avoiding things that are female or feminine. So we don't want to do that. That would be bad. Right? The hope, though, is that we can come to respect feminine and masculine traits equally, right? That we need to be able to learn to respect feminine and masculine traits equally, whatever those traits. So being nurturing and caring, being valued right along with leadership is something that we need to learn to value equally. So essentially, what I'm saying here, and this is more really sort of true commentary, nothing you have to know, but I would invite you to consider, is that let the boys and the girls really be themselves, right? And it's hard to do, by the way, with children, to not respond to them in certain ways and say, oh yeah, you're a tough little guy, aren't you? It's hard not to do that, but let them react to something and then say, oh, you get banged up pretty bad, or oh, you, for a sensitive thing, that's okay, right? And to validate that, or to say, boy, you're a tough little one, right? After it happens, but sort of let them be themselves and respond to it from there, whether that's masculine or feminine. Let's just let them be themselves and try to encourage or discourage those parts of them, but really try to encourage them and help them to grow to be kind, empowered, and fulfilled.